So as Jen said, I'm Jennifer Wong, and I'm going to be talking about empathetic design systems. So this is me. I really like animals, obviously. I'm a software engineer, and here's some social media things. And I'm pretty excited to announce that starting Monday, I will be working as an engineer at Envoy. And we're hiring! Yay! So if you're interested, come talk to me afterwards. We take remote engineers also. So let's get started. What is a design system? How many people know what a design system is? And keep your hands up if you have worked on a design system. Okay, that's like 25% of the crowd. It's pretty good. Well, I'm here to tell you, design systems are super trendy. Wow. So cool. So Brad Frost coined the term atomic design in 2013. So I'm kind of guessing design systems started to become popular around that time. But honestly, I can't really say. But UXPin defines a design system as a complete set of design standards, documentation, and principles along with a toolkit. And that toolkit may be UI patterns or code components, and those are to achieve those standards. So you may have heard the terms pattern library, component library, style guide, but a rose by any other name is probably just a design system. You don't really have to have every one of these components to make a design system, but in case you do, a pattern library tends to be a set of design patterns that are used across the company. A component library is a set of reusable components, again, to be used across the company. And then a style guide is some static documentation that describes some guidelines around the design system, things like typography and color usage. So let's take a look at some design systems that exist today. The first off is Spectrum, and Spectrum is created by Adobe. I first heard about it via a speaker, Sarah Fetterman. She works on Spectrum, and that was at a conference called Forward.js. So if you take a look here, there's a screenshot of every iteration of button from Spectrum. It's a lot of buttons. And so that's on light backgrounds, dark backgrounds, used across different devices, and they're all completely different. So Spectrum is huge, Adobe is huge. Interestingly, Spectrum is private, so I kind of stole this screenshot, don't tell them. And Spectrum is expected to span all of the hundreds of products and services that Adobe serves. This is the US web design system created by 18F. It's open source, and 18F is essentially a consultancy that lives inside of the General Services Administration. So these are all of their buttons, not too many buttons. All of their buttons are the same across devices. And this system is used by a few dozen government agencies and over 100 sites because it is open source, so it can be used anywhere. This is a style guide that I found on Mozilla. It's open source, but it hasn't been updated in over a year, so I think it was put up there, and it can be used, but I don't think it's very up to date. I just thought it was kind of interesting because there are just a few buttons. But more interestingly, I did a little bit more digging, and I found Photon, which is a style guide specifically used for Firefox. So this is an interesting style guide specifically because it's just for one product that Mozilla creates. And it also is open source and was last updated a few months ago. So again, design systems of all sizes. All right, so moving on, what is empathy? Google tells me that empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And we can see that empathy comes from the Greek words which stands for in, or which means in, and pathos, which is feeling. So it means to be in feeling. And we can see in this graph below that the usage of the word empathy has gone up over the years. And I pulled this from Google Books, the Ngram viewer. So empathy is trendy. Design systems are trendy. Let's put them together. So earlier I spoke of UXPin, and they're a collaborative design platform for prototyping and creating design systems. So they ran a survey called the Enterprise UX Industry Report and surveyed about 3,200 people. In that survey, there were mostly designers, but there were some developers as well. One of the questions in that survey was, what challenges do you currently face in your UX process? So a lot of these challenges I looked at, and I noticed that they're very related to empathy. The first stuff is improving UX consistency, so having some empathy for your users. Testing designs with your users, so again, empathy with your users. Clarifying requirements, so that's typically communication between your product manager and your designer, so empathy between those two teams as well. Collaborating between teams, so probably between feature teams, between front-end teams, and having empathy between all of those teams. Getting buy-in or understanding from executives, so hoping to have empathy from your executives. And last off, handing off designs to developers, so having empathy between the development and the design team. So that's kind of like what empathy is all about. It's about teamwork. And more teamwork. So everyone's working together. It's also kind of about, we hear often the metaphor for wearing each other's shoes or understanding what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And then just having like understanding between people. So I talk generally specifically about empathy between developers and designers. So just trying to avoid that like over-the-wall design where you just kind of like throw your designs over to developers code, and then throw that back over to the designers. Like being able to work together and having empathy for each of those teams. So moving on, Eventbrite's design system. So why did we want to create a design system? Because we wanted to be part of the future. Yeah. So also going back to the survey, we wanted to resolve some of these challenges as well. The first of which was improving UX consistency, and then also collaboration between teams. And then lastly, kind of moving on from a legacy technology that we had. So when did we decide to create this design system? Well, we wanted to have that UX consistency, and the way we were doing that was to have a complete rebrand of Eventbrite altogether. And then also replacing our legacy technology. So we actually had an old style guide, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And then we were moving from Backbone over to React as the popularity of React increased. So here you can see some explorations by our design team. So originally, the design system was kind of centered around this rebrand. So it was typically driven by our branding team and about a lot of this visual exploration. And who was in charge of creating this design team, or design system? So we had a front-end foundry team, and that consisted of 3 of our most senior front-end engineers and 3 of our entry-level engineers. So these were some engineers that we had hired straight out of boot camps and were tasked with creating a lot of the foundational components for our design system. We had a product manager, and our product manager originally was a design manager, which gave him a really good understanding of what a design system needed. And typically it included almost our entire design team, because our design team was creating designs around all of the components that would go into the design system. So onto our old school style guide. Some details about that style guide were that it was created with KSS, which stands for Nile Style Sheets, so named for the creator, Kyle Neath. So KSS basically auto-generates style guide documentation with HTML and CSS. And funnily, I just took a look and saw that the last commit was made by Ben Schwartz, who spoke earlier today. And that was in 2016. So this is what KSS looks like. You'll see above a set of comments in a CSS file or a Sass file. And that basically writes out the documentation and classes around our style guide. Below that, you'll see the CSS or the Sass that we've created around each of those classes. Unfortunately, our style guide was brittle, so we had no systematic way of adding new features or styles. Our cascade in the CSS often meant that styles or classes overrode each other, and the comment style section numbering sometimes required some manual finagling. So if we go back again to the KSS, you can see here, there's a button called, I think, button bright, and I don't know who added that or why they added it or what a bright button is. So we can see there's no systematic way around finding that information out. We see here we have modifier classes, but again, with the classes being added in this way, we can't necessarily predict how the cascade will work. And then lastly, you can see the style guide sections. So sometimes we would actually have to manually edit these section numbers. So on to the future, EDS, which stands for Eventbrite Design System. So Nathan Curtis once said, a style guide is an artifact of the design process, whereas a design system is a living, funded product with a roadmap and backlog serving an ecosystem, which in Eventbrite's case was true. We had a product manager, we had a lot of buy-in from people above for our design system, whereas our style guide was an artifact of our design process, where we were just kind of like adding styles into our development process. So some things we got right with our design system. So first off, we actually created a component generator. So our component generator used plop.js, which creates a boilerplate of code files. And here's a GIF of what happens using plop. So what we're going to do first is we're going to name our component. It's called Snazzy Time. Then we decide if it belongs under foundation, organisms, molecules, or atoms. And once we do that, we create this consistent pattern of files. So we have an example, we have a page that example lives in, we have a README, we have UI tests, we have unit tests, we have our component JSX, we have our component SAS, and then we also edit the design system documentation navigation information. Sorry, that was a lot of words. To include this new Snazzy Time component. So that was pretty cool, very consistent, systematic way of adding things. We were really good at having documentation around our design system. We had a lot of information on onboarding and information around atomic design. So you can see here a list of some of the documentation that we had. The front-end Foundry team created a planned approach, so a structured way of adding a component. Basically, what you would do was you would sit down with our front-end Foundry team and talk about edge cases around a component. You would talk about what props it required, things like that. So I think in my conference talk summary, I said that we didn't do a good job of accessibility, and that was actually a lie. We did a decent job of it. So we started off by using this JSX Ally plugin, which helped with accessibility around each of our components. And with modals, we did a really great job of making those accessible, and modals are notoriously hard to get right related to accessibility. So those are a bunch of the things that we did pretty well. But then we also had some problems, which typically were caused by a lack of empathy. So the first thing you do when you come to a design system typically is you're going to probably search for a component. Unfortunately, what I'm saying here is you don't know what you don't know, because when you come to this design system, you need to know what things are named before you can even search for them. So I have a screenshot here of searching for a dropdown, and we can see the results of that are a dropdown or a dropdown menu. But I don't actually know what the difference between these two are. And additionally, if we look at the navigation over on the left, we can see that dropdown is a subcomponent of dropdown. So I don't really know how to find out more information about that. Belatedly, naming things is really hard, and we can see that in the dropdown, underneath the dropdown, and then the dropdown menu as well. So making sure that you name things to be very obvious what something is very helpful. With our design system, another issue we had was that our design system was originally under the code name Black Panda. And another thing that I find interesting is that EDS it's an acronym. So if you're coming to a company for the first time and you hear EDS thrown around, you don't necessarily know what it means. Another issue we saw with our design system is being able to tell if a component is deprecated. It might be. So we see here we have a card list, and there's an alert up at the top of the page, and the alert says, component is unstable and subject to change. But if I'm coming here for the first time, I don't necessarily know what that means. What does unstable mean? What does subject to change mean? Does this mean that this component is deprecated? For me, I know because I've been using this design system, so I know that we shouldn't be using this component. But coming here for the first time, it's really hard to tell where to get more information about this. Another issue we saw was another deprecation issue. So here I have a screenshot of our text inputs and then our input fields. So I was on a feature team that was creating a feature that used our text input, but we didn't know that our design system or our design team had planned to create a new component called input fields. So because we needed to start using these new input fields and they hadn't been built yet, our feature team was delayed in our roadmap as we created these new input fields. Also, there's a lot of confusion around our components. Like, when and where do I use specific types of components? So here we see a drop-down, and we see a drop-down menu, we see a select, and we also see a select field. So if we look at all of these components, almost all of them have a title and a down arrow. Presumably, if you click on it or if you hover over it, you're going to see a list of items below. So it can be really hard to tell which one you're supposed to use at any given point in time because they seem to all serve the same function. And again, coming back to naming things being hard, our select field is underneath our input field. So if I go back to these screenshots, you see if I search for select field doesn't come up in my search. So I also have this little mountain lion here. I call it a mountain lion, but I know some people call it a puma, and I've also heard mountain screamer before. So again, naming things is really hard. Another issue we ran into was making sure that our designers could contribute to our design system. So there's a very steep learning curve with React, especially for designers who aren't necessarily working in code every day. So you see here a screenshot of our buttons, and there's no way to find out where the CSS is, what CSS is behind each of these button styles. And then if you go to the code, you see that there's a whole button folder. There are many more CSS inputs into the button coming from different parts of the code base, so that can get really complicated as well. Another issue that I personally ran into was the difference between our grid system and our alignment classes. So our grid system used display inline block, and our alignment classes actually used display flexbox. So if you use those in combination, sometimes they override each other and things get really wonky. So I actually used a feature that was using both and kind of edited the styles, but because that component was being used across many other people's features, I kind of made everybody else's feature really wonky too. Lastly, one of the issues that we saw was that our release process was very complicated. So with our release process, Front-End Foundry would release our design system once a week, and that design system needed to be bumped in our core repository, and that was typically once a week as well. Interestingly, Front-End Foundry was one of the few teams that didn't use our design system in production, so many of the future teams were left waiting in order to release their features and products while our design system was being released. So there was a lack of empathy there where we needed to get stuff out the door. So coming back to the survey, I think we did a really good job of replacing our legacy technology and improving our UX consistency, but we required a lot more collaboration between our teams. So here are some solutions that we found which were backed by empathy. First of which, we wanted to create a better search. Unfortunately, I don't have any screenshots of this better search, but the plan was to have better search and discoverability. So we were going to change our navigation to have less spacing so you could, at a glance, see all of the different categorizations of the components. There was going to be a better way to search for information across the code base instead of just searching for component titles. And then lastly, what we wanted to do was have a homepage with small screenshots of each of the components so you could see them at a glance. I'm sorry, this is a long GIF. I bet it's playing over and over again. My bad. And then naming, we wanted to start to name things better. So we wanted to make things named easier and stop using acronyms. So we stopped using Black Panda. We started using Eventbrite Design System where we could, and we made sure we purged our entire code base of the term Black Panda so that it didn't confuse people who are coming to the design system for the first time. Communication became a really big part of this empathy as well. So we started this front-end guild where we had weekly meetings and a design system Slack channel. That really helped us with the grid system and alignment issue that I saw earlier, because I could discuss the nuance and the difference between the grid system and the alignment and the usage of Flexbox or inline block. And then additionally, communication about creating new components. So the text input versus the input field. Just having communication around knowing what's coming down the line. And then having component clarity. So we were planning to create usage guidelines. So kind of explaining when you should use specific components where. And those guidelines are to be written by our UX designers. And those would go under our component documentation. Another plan was to include our designers with React a little bit better using tools like React Studio. So you see here, you can create a prototype of a component as a designer, and React Studio will spit out React code. So a designer has a closer tie to the React code so they can see what their prototype looks like in React. And one of the last solutions that we had was to have a better release process. So instead of being released once a week, anytime someone made a major, minor, or a patch change to our design system, it was automatically released. And instead of bumping just once a week, we started bumping twice a week on Mondays and Wednesdays before our core repository was released and deployed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So that was really helpful. And additionally, one of our engineers created a bot, and she had that bot kind of reach out to different people across the engineering team based on their commit history to bump the design system in core. So that gave a really good understanding of our release process to many more engineers instead of just those on front-end Foundry. So what should you do if you're creating a design system? You should empathize. Think about who's going to use it. Are designers going to use it? Product managers, engineers, QA engineers, your marketing team, or maybe even external stakeholders, people who are your customers if your design system becomes open source. Try to think about all of the ways that someone might use a design system and different edge cases, or the way that they might use the design system in ways you don't expect. Originally, we created our design system to kind of be on a need-to-know basis, but we definitely recommend not doing that anymore. And we are champions of sharing that information about our design system widely and deeply across the company. Documentation is really great. Write the docs. Build a great search for people to be able to search for components. Have a centralized place to see what components have been designed, which ones have been built, which ones have modifications or are maybe subcomponents of another component, or which components have been deprecated. So we see on MDM here, this is a really great centralized place where you can see where features have been deprecated or maybe obsolete. Have a process around your design system so that people know how the design system works. So maybe a step-by-step guide for someone to get started, or better yet, multiple step-by-step guides for each type of user that you might see with your design system. Some helpful tools to get started with your design system. This is Storybook, which is a UI development environment. It's open source. It has tons of contributors. It's really great and comes more from the the engineer's perspective of a design system. Oop, jumping ahead. And then, as I mentioned earlier, UXPin, which is a UX design platform. And that comes more from like the designer's perspective of design systems. There are many more tools out there, so I encourage doing exploration around that as well. So in conclusion, do as I say and not as I do. So I keep telling everyone, like, empathize with your users, your coworkers, everyone who may be using this design system or exposed to it. Because we didn't do as great a job at Eventbrite. We're doing a lot better. But yeah, learn from the mistakes that Eventbrite made. And use empathy. So here are some resources, and that's all I have for you.
So I'm not a designer, but I work with designers a lot, and I used to do consulting, and I really enjoyed working with design and not having that sort of over-the-wall kind of setup, because that was like pretty typical, and it is at like a lot of like older, larger companies. There's sort of like a devaluing of the designer versus the engineer, and this definitely like flips the script. How did you balance working like the engineer and design side? Like you gave the resources where like Storybook is very engineer focused and the other one's more designer. Was it hard to balance those two types of people? Because you had a pretty large team,
yeah.
Right?
So I'd say that it could be complicated from time to time balancing that, but typically we would have meetings where designers and developers were there constantly. So the front-end guild, we usually had a combination of both types of people, so that we could get a sense of like what tools would work for both sides, what tools actually only worked for one, and deciding there what to move forward with.
Cool. How did the team delegate documentation? We always say like documentation is really important, but just like testing and performance and accessibility, like which all sort of are roped in together, like how did you delegate who was to do documentation? And was it hard to get into a pattern of it not being an afterthought?
So I think with the component generator, we did a pretty good job of building in the need or creation of documentation with each new component. So it got automatically delegated based on who was creating a component at any given point in time. I'd say additionally, there were code reviews, so if you didn't write documentation, you definitely got called out for it.
And was that all done through like a GitHub repo, like internally, or is this design system open source?
It's not. No, it's a private design system as well. So the documentation kind of lived as its own repo in GitHub, but then also it created its own documentation, which was like more visually appealing.
Cool. I think from like my perspective, design systems are a lot like APIs, you know, and especially if you open source the design system for other people to use. Was there discussion around open sourcing the design system?
Yeah, there was a lot. So I think it can kind of help get your name out there. And if it's a good design system and people are using it, that's pretty exciting to kind of like include your users as well.
But then you have to deal with like becoming a developer designer community like steward, and that can be kind of stressful as well, right? Because then otherwise you end up with, you know, a design system of buttons that haven't been updated in a year, or is
right.
Last updated by Ben, Benifer over there. So you had shown some other design system examples. What was that prior art or anything else an inspiration for how Eventbrite created its design system? Was there like some like golden example that were like, we want this, but for us?
Yeah, I think what most of the team was taking inspiration from was typically like Airbnb's design system. It was kind of gold standard to us. I didn't put it up as an example because I feel like it gets a lot of press, so I was like, oh, I'll put some other ones up there.
Cool. Another thing, back to open source. I talk to a lot of designers who are like, oh, I want to get into open source, but I don't want to like just be delegated to update documentation. And I think design systems are a great way to get designers into an open source community because that can provide a lot of value to a framework that wants like examples and stuff like that. Have you been involved in design systems for any like other open source projects, or is this your first sort of time doing that, but internally?
So this is essentially the first time and internal, so I haven't been involved in any open source design systems. I like taking a look at the US web design standards just because I find it's really interesting that we have a design system for websites that are used across the country by millions and millions of people.
So my final question. They say that the hardest problem in computer science is naming things, but it sounds like you've solved that problem.
Yeah, I mean, just name everything Jennifer.
Thank you. You see, the ferns, everybody. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for Jen.